I did spot a question from Ben. Well, I think it was when you switched on the static caching and there was that header that came through. I think it was the X served cache header that said bypass, and Ben was just asking, did served assign that header and how?
Served did assign that header, which is why it specifically got served in the title, and it is being added by Nginx because it's actually I've used SR cache within served to implement static caching at the web server level, and SR cache, the plugin for Nginx, gives us lots of options for how and when we store caches at the web server level. One of the things it can do is track whether a cache is being served to the client or not. And once you know whether a cache is being served or not, you can then attach it as a header to the response before it goes back to the user. So that's how that's working.
I might expand on that question, if that's okay, Matt.
Yeah, go nuts.
But that header was set when you were logged in. So I assume that you have like a served plugin installed, or how did served know that you were logged in?
Okay, so if I were to be logged in, that would come back as a bypass, and SR cache would bypass the cache because it knew that I was logged into Craft. SR cache knows that I am logged into Craft because it sniffs the cookies that are being set by Craft when you log in. And if the cookies have been set by Craft, then it will bypass because it assumes you are logged in.
Okay, so that's like one of the Craft session username or something like that.
Yes. I don't think it's using username because I think that's a variable. Let's have a look. I can have a look at the cookies that are assigned. So if I now go back to here, we can have a look at the cookies. It's using this cookie, random string underscore identity, which is the underscore identity is static, and that's set by Craft. So you can rely on that being set if someone is logged into the Craft control panel.
Okay. I do have a few other questions, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So, and also thank you for such a great presentation and going so in depth on caching. That was really interesting. And for mentioning Blitz, I was going to say if you'd used Blitz on your demos, maybe they would have worked better. But
not tonight. It would have broken tonight.
But I saw that you used served, and that was interesting to see how you were changing some of those settings directly from served rather than having to do it on a configuration level.
Yes.
Let's see. So yeah, I wanted to ask about Cloudflare and SSL. I know that they have different SSL settings. So you can have like strict SSL, which means that there's an SSL on your origin server and you have one on Cloudflare. So in theory, the communication is encrypted, but you're saying that at some stage in between that communication, the traffic is decrypted and then re-encrypted. Is that what's going on?
That is exactly what happens. And I've just noticed that my face is essentially black. So I'm just going to switch the light on. So you can see me. Hang on.
There we go.
So yes, that is exactly what's happening. The request will go to Cloudflare's CDN server, and the SSL connection between and the CDN server will terminate at Cloudflare's edge node. They will decrypt the traffic using their own SSL certificate. They will then use the information within the HTTP request to generate the cache. That's how they can cache based on the URL, because otherwise, if they couldn't see inside the packet, they wouldn't be able to cache based on the URL. Then they re-encrypt it, send it to the origin server using the origin server's SSL certificate to do the encryption. And then with the response, they'll decrypt it and then re-encrypt it again and send it back to the client. So however you use Cloudflare, unless you use some of their enterprise tools, which allow you to do SSL forwarding stuff, you will end up with your data being fully decrypted and stored within Cloudflare's CDN layer.
That's interesting. It's good to know as well for the future. And then I guess the other question I had was regarding your anecdote about your DDoS bot concerning the email signatures, because that's a real question. How do you cache 404 pages? I mean, obviously you can cache the rendered template, but you can't really cache it at the CDN level. You can't really cache it at the web server level, because I assume that your CMS might have, you know, a dynamic way of generating URLs. So essentially, that request has to go all the way through, in this case, to whatever the routing is done by, probably Craft CMS. How do you avoid somebody performing a DDoS on your server simply by hitting it with 404 requests?
With random URLs, yeah. So one thing we did to mitigate that was to stop URLs that don't look like real URLs from being forwarded to PHP. So, for instance, the default setup for Nginx, if you just look up Nginx fast CGI PHP on the internet, it will give you some boilerplate templates that will forward all 404 requests. So any file that doesn't exist on the file system will go to PHP, and then PHP can process it. The problem we were having with that particular anecdote is that someone was requesting image files, and all of those were being forwarded to PHP. And there are use cases where that might be useful if you're dynamically generating image files, or maybe you've got like some security layer in front of an asset that you want PHP to process before it serves the image file. There are use cases where that's useful, but in our case, none of that was appropriate. So the first thing we did was just, if this looks like a static file, if it's an image or a JavaScript file or a CSS file, never forward it to PHP. That solved our problem pretty much straight away. However, you still have the issue of what if the URL looks like a standard URL?
Yeah.
For that situation, it's harder, because if you want the 404 page to be truly dynamic, then you have to do some sort of processing in order to generate those dynamic pages. However, there's no reason why you can't do multi-level caching in that scenario. So for a 404 request, for instance, you could handle the caching within Craft itself by doing some like long TTL cache on specifically on the 404 page, but then all of your other caches are handled by Cloudflare. So to answer your question, I guess it's on a per use basis, but you can mix and match those different techniques in order to fix the particular problem for that particular website based on the type of content that it's serving. That's the approach that I would take anyway.
Cool. And maybe final question. So you were doing something with served, it was setting those headers, but how can served specifically be used to implement these different caching levels, or what can served do to help with that?
Okay, so at the Craft level, the PHP level, that's up to you. So served tries not to get too involved in the day-to-day execution of your PHP scripts. So you can implement cache tags however you want, and it won't get too involved in that. The nice thing about Craft storing its cache files in the database is that it's intrinsically works with high availability setups as well. So if you have multiple PHP instances running, they will share the same cache that's generated by cache tags by offloading them to the single database storage, essentially. So serve doesn't have to do anything interesting to help with that, and it just leaves you to either do it well or do it not well, depending on your preference. At the web server level, it will do everything for you. So as I mentioned, it's using SR cache, and all that is activated and configured with that switch in the dashboard. Am I still presenting? I am. So static caching in served is a single switch which allows you to just activate static caching. That will begin caching all of your URLs using SR cache. And again, that's set up so it's nice and high availability and stuff. You can also set exceptions. So I mentioned that it can be a bit quirky to define exceptions for static caching at the web server level. And this tries to get around that problem. So you can just define URL prefixes, which will be completely ignored from the static cache. So by default, serve will set /admin and /actions as the excluded URL prefixes, just to make sure that you don't cache your craft control panel when you switch that on.
Yeah.
And then at the Cloudflare level, again, serve doesn't try to do anything specific at the moment. The one thing it does do to help with that is that by default, it will make sure all the SSL is set up to support full encryption between Cloudflare and served. Just by default for all projects, you don't have to do anything to make that work. So all you need to do is just whack your DNS settings into Cloudflare and switch on static caching in Cloudflare, and it should just all start working. I'm at some point in the future, served is going to have deeper integration with Cloudflare to allow what's it called? Railgun. So Railgun is a compression engine inside the Origin server infrastructure, which allows responses to be compressed before they are sent out to the Cloudflare CDN network. So that's one thing that's going to be added. And also automatic generation of Cloudflare projects from the serve dashboard will eventually be added. So you'll just be able to tick a box that says, set me up on Cloudflare, please. And it will configure everything for you within Cloudflare using the Cloudflare API. None of that's built yet, but it's planned in. So it will make things a lot easier going forward. But currently, that's where it stands.
Very cool. Thank you.
Anyone else?
I think there was one further question in the chat from Tom Davies. So that was, it was when you were looking at the cookies, and I think that identity cookie.
Yeah.
If that gets renamed via the sort of general PHP, does that still work? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I wasn't aware that you could rename the identity cookie specifically.
Oh, okay. Is that not?
Thought it was hard coded, but if Tom knows better than me, then he should send me a message because I'll need to change some stuff.
Okay. Okay. Well, maybe he's wrong on that one. I'm not sure if he's still on the call. He might have ducked out already.
He might know better than me.
Yeah,
but
I think he has ducked out.
I originally wrote that bit of code based off I think it was a long time ago. I believe I went through the source code to figure out whether it could change or not in different circumstances and checked, but I might be misremembering that. So in answer to Tom's question, if you were to rename that cookie, it would stop working. However, it wouldn't stop working dramatically. It would just end up caching the hits made by admin users on the front end. Cache exception stuff would still work, but requests made by admin users would get cached and they would be served to cache. So you just lose that little bit of extra fancy functionality, which makes sure admins aren't seeing cached content.
Okay, cool. All right. Any other questions?
I'm full of questions. I could jump in with another. I just don't want to take up someone else's slot.
I don't think there's anyone else. Go for it, Ben.
So Cloudflare has something called Cloudflare Workers, and I'm not sure. I've looked a little bit into this. I'm not sure if you have, Matt, so I don't mean to put you on the spot, but essentially it allows you to push files out onto the edge nodes rather than have them request those from your Origin server. Do you know if that is an easy process? Have you looked into that? Is it really just a matter of pushing them out? Or is it like, I don't know, is it more complicated than that?
I've not used them for anything production. However, from what I've read, Cloudflare workers are scripting on the edge. So essentially, I spoke about being able to run Lua as part of Nginx before. So you can run scripting as part of the reverse proxy process within Nginx.
Mhm.
Cloudflare workers are essentially the same thing. However, they run on the CDN reverse proxies instead of on your origin reverse proxy. They've done some really cool stuff with it. It supports multiple languages like Lambda does, and I think they transpile all the languages, which is really interesting. So a few days ago, they released a COBOL transpiler for it, so you can actually write worker logic in COBOL and deploy it to all of their CDN edge nodes. And so essentially, workers allow you to run custom logic at the edge. The caching portion of it is that those workers can interact with the local caches on those edge nodes. So you can write custom content to those caches, and you can also read content arbitrarily from those caches based on whatever keys you want. They also have an API which allows you to write to those caches, and so you can push content to those worker caches and then write script which intercepts requests and reads from the cache. So in that way, you can push content and serve it based on whatever logic you want to push to the edge nodes.
Yeah. So you can do that plus a whole lot more, it sounds like.
You can do all sorts of stuff. It's actually really, they're quite lenient on the amount of stuff that you can do within a worker as well. I can't remember the exact timings, but a worker process is limited by the number of seconds or number of milliseconds of CPU execution that it uses, but the CPU execution doesn't include time that it's spent waiting for things. So you can do things like read from the cache, and the actual time spent reading from the cache isn't included in the overall billing for the worker. And you can also contact your origin server, and you can pull content from there, and that time to contact the origin server isn't included in the total time that's used to bill against the worker. And then essentially you're only getting billed for the part of the code that's stitching all that together into the actual final request. And then they're quite lenient with the free tier on that as well. You get something like, I think it's either in the hundreds of thousands of seconds or somewhere around there. But you can essentially run a service which is serving millions of requests for free using those workers. And it's all super quick because it's all on the edge using their proprietary, whatever their logic processor is there.
Cool, thanks.
I've looked at how big the free tier is for that because I was really impressed by it.
I thought workers were not on the free tier. Or maybe they've moved.
Your first 100,000 requests per day are free. And then it's $5 per 10 million requests. But a request is measured based on the time it takes or something like that. So like a request can be a maximum of 300 milliseconds, but that's CPU time. So it ends up being really reasonable. If you give it a go, then let me know because I've not actually used it yet. It sounds quite cool.